notion that reading literature is good for you into a question. And the question is, what are the psychological effects of reading fiction? And Raymond had the very good idea that if we could measure the amount of fiction people read, we could look at the effects on their empathy and their understanding of other people. And so we used a modification of the method devised by Keith Stanovich, who was in our department as well, and Richard West, to estimate the amount of fiction and non-fiction that people read. And our main outcome measure was the mind in the eyes test, which was invented by Simon Baron-Cohen in England.
Yeah, and
so
that's what they're saying.
So, okay, so can you see this slide now? Can everybody see that?
About joking.
So there's a person's eyes, and then there's 4 words: joking, flustered, desire, convinced. And so there are 36 of these photos looking through a little, like a little letterbox. And what you have to do is to say what this person is feeling. So if you're at a party and you see someone looking at you like that and you think she is joking, you might be missing something. So the correct answer for this is desire.
Do you want the next slide?
So what we did then is we looked at the amount of fiction and non-fiction that people read, and we found that the more fiction they read, the better they were at this task, by quite a bit. And there you are on the left with the blue bar. But people who read mostly non-fiction, you know, about, I don't know, genetics or astronomy or something, they were less good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And so Raymond and Jennifer Tackett and Chris Moore found a similar effect of children being told stories, preschool children, 5- and 6-year-old, in their understanding of other people. And then Maya and I and McNear Moldavino, in an experiment, found that people who in their personality were low in the personality trait of openness improved their empathy by reading fiction. So here's a little study, well, quite a big study by Raymond, and he looked at all the published work on fMRI studies and looked at the brain areas where people were understanding other people's minds, and looked at the brain areas which were involved when you read a story. And these little spots in yellow are the places where those overlap. And so there's quite a lot of areas in the brain where reading fiction is about understanding other people's minds. So empathy is experiencing an emotion which is like that of someone else. And it's important in everyday life because it is central to understanding other people. And in fiction, it's the means by which, within a fictional simulation, we can identify with the protagonist. And what we do, it's a bit like meditation. So you put aside your own concerns and you take on those of a character. And the emotions that we feel aren't those of the character. How could they be? They're our own emotions in the situation that the character is in. And so reading fiction is a kind of practice at doing this in social simulations, and it helps improve empathy and understanding of others from within. So in another experiment, we asked people to read one of the world's most famous short stories by Anton Chekhov. It's called The Lady with the Little Dog, or a control text. And then before and after reading, we measured their big 5 personality traits and the intensity of 10 emotions that they were feeling at that time. And this story is about a man who, while staying at a seaside resort, meets a woman who he's seen walking with a little dog. And they begin an affair, but at the end of their holiday, they separate, but their feelings for each other become more important than anything else in their lives. And the control text, which was in a non-fictional format, which was written by Maya and Sarah Zerterman, was in the form of a report from a divorce court, and it had exactly the same characters and events and exactly the same information as Chekhov's story, and it was the same length and the same level of reading difficulty, and readers found it just as interesting but not as artistic. And so here are the effects of this. So people who read Chekhov's story changed their personality by a bit. And the amount that they changed their personality was mediated by the strength of the emotions that they felt while reading. But it wasn't like persuasion, because everybody changed in different ways. Everyone changed in their own way. And so it's very different from advertising or, political rhetoric. So the amount of, and so this is an effect of art rather than fiction as such. And so we've replicated this effect with people reading one of 8 literary essays or 8 literary short stories. And the issue is not so much fiction versus non-fiction, but art versus non-art. Now, at the moment, we've only found short-term effects, but we think in the end they're going to accumulate. So here's this idea of theory of mind in Marcel Proust's novel. So not far into the first book of this is this: however deeply we sympathize, a real human being is perceived mainly by our senses. This means that the person remains, sorry.
Just see if I can.
The person remains opaque to us and offers a dead weight that our perceptions cannot lift. If a misfortune should strike this person, it's only in a small part of the total understanding that we have that we can be moved by this. The discovery of the novelist is the idea of replacing those parts that are impenetrable to the mind by an equal quantity of immaterial parts, that's to say, parts that our minds can assimilate, and within ours set free states of happiness and unhappiness of kinds that would take years of our ordinary life to come to know. Can I speak again?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So can you see me again now? Yeah. Okay. So these are just some of our results. And recently this topic has sort of rather taken off. And so our results have been replicated by quite a few other research groups. But the idea that there is fact or fiction isn't all that helpful in psychology. It's better to think of what the subject matter is. So you know that the subject matter of astronomy is stars and planets. And so if you read astronomy, that's what you learn about. And if you read fiction, the subject matter is about us human beings and how we get on with each other. And that's what we learn about. Okay, so that's the end of my little talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr.
Okay, did that come through all right?
Sorry?
Did that come through all right?
I think that came through all right. We'll see. We're already getting some questions in the chat, and we'll see which other questions we get throughout the talk. But thank you very much. I think that was a very good introduction to the experimental study of fiction from psychology and from neuroscience, which is such a fascinating field. So I'm gonna introduce our second speaker now, who is Dr. Yael Halevi-Weiss. Dr. Halevi-Weiss is an associate professor of English and Jewish studies at McGill University. She is an expert in the history of the novel and comparative literature, especially 19th century English literature, 20th century Latin American literature and contemporary Israeli literature. She has previously taught at Brandeis, Cornell, and Princeton, and has been the recipient of SSHRC and FRQSC grants, as well as a Lady Davis Fellowship at the Institute of Arts and Letters, Hebrew University. She is the author of many articles and 3 books, including the book Interactive Fictions, Scenes of Storytelling in the Novel, in which she looks at the novel as an open window to social and generic dilemmas, demonstrating why both gender and culture must be taken into account when we analyze the formation and reception of a narrative. So that being said, welcome, Dr. Halevi Weiss. The stage is yours.
Thank you. I was delighted to be invited to participate in this Convergence initiative about research on the brain, literary fiction, and social cognition. Just a second, I don't know why they're making so much noise upstairs. That's my family. And I was especially delighted because over 20 years ago, when I first conceived my project that became this book that Fernanda just mentioned, here, Interactive Fictions, Scenes of Storytelling in the Novel, and it was published in 2003. But of course, the work on it started much earlier. So when I was thinking about what I wanted to study and what its benefits were, I thought that one of them could be related to cognitive science, but that seemed a very, very wacky, unrealistic idea. So to be suddenly sort of discovered by this group validates that intuition, and I'm very interested. Actually, you haven't explained to me how you discovered this work and why you wanted to integrate it. So I'm starting with a question that I'm throwing to the organizers, and I'm very curious. So this book, Interactive Fictions, about scenes of storytelling in the novel, examines the way that characters argue about how to tell a story. The stories that they argue about are all fictional stories. They are sometimes based on their psychological situation, on their experience, on their problems. They are sometimes always, to a greater or lesser extent, integrated with their experience at the moment of telling the story. But what I was interested in was to examine the arguments between the storyteller and the audience as they were played out in great works of fiction. So these are stories within the story, within the novel. And I looked at examples in Cervantes, in Dickens, in Jane Austen, in Fielding, in Laura Esquivel from Mexico, and in Mr. Money by A.B. Joshua from Israel. I did, and Conrad as well, each chapter devoted to a very close case study of this kind of interaction between characters about storytelling. And I try to understand what happens when a character that has a certain worldview and certain experiences presents or starts to present them in some way in a story, or just tells a story that emerges or not from his or her worldview. And then how does that relate to the reception of the audience within the fictional world? The audience may be of a different gender, of a different age, often different class, different interests. So we see this dynamic that is about fiction, but it's also a social dynamic. Now, to be sure, this is just a model. It's a fictional model at that, and it's a mimetic model. In other words, it's fiction imitating life, pretending to be about storytelling, but it's just pretend. So we are many stages removed from actual research of the kind that Professor Oatley was just mentioning. But nevertheless, I think that even looking at this kind of interaction around the storytelling situation, where you can understand the motivations of the teller and you can understand the problems of the listener, and the arguments go back and forth, and together they craft what emerges as the text of the story, that sensitizes us to the kind of situation that we might examine from a cognitive science perspective. It maybe suggests even where to look and how. And it can also illustrate for us, and I think this is very important, the differences between what happens in real life situations where people are arguing about a story or a narrative versus what happens in a model, such as we might get in any of my examples. So to give you a quick example for my first big case study on Don Quixote de la Mancha, Miguel de Cervantes' great novel, which was written 17th century Spain, beginning of the 17th century. And we have this man, Alonso Quijano, who wakes up one day, he wants to be a knight, and he calls himself Don Quixote. He's impoverished and he's aging, but he is a gentleman. And he's also bored, and he wants to go out and have adventures and fix the world based on the standards of chivalric romance that he had been reading. So along with him, he brings a helper, Sancho Panza, a rotund, delightful peasant that has a completely different worldview and personality from Don Quixote. And out they go. Don Quixote sees windmills. You all know this example probably, right? He sees the windmills, he goes and he attacks the windmills, he gets mauled. And Don Quixote and Sancho says, "Why did you do this? I told you you can't go against these windmills." Don Quixote says, "No, they're not windmills. These are giants. But the wizards who persecuting me turned them into windmills." Then at another point, some months later, Don Quixote says to Sancho Panza, "Go and report the wonderful things that I've done to my lady Dulcinea." So Sancho Panza says, "Who is Dulcinea?" Don Quixote says it's some woman. Turns out it's a peasant that Don Quixote imagines as a lady from chivalric romance. So Sancho Panza goes, he actually sees her, he brings back some kind of a message. It's very funny. But a long time later, Don Quixote and Sancho Panza are far away from their hometown, far away from that peasant that Don Quixote imagines as Dulcinea. And then Don Quixote says to Sancho, "I want you to bring Dulcinea here." So Sancho says, how, he doesn't say to him, "How can I do it?" But he sits and he thinks, and then some peasant passes by and he tells Don Quixote, "That's Dulcinea." And Don Quixote, "That can be," says, Sancho says, "She's been enchanted." So he has learned from Don Quixote's way of embellishing reality to make stories. He has learned how to expediently craft a story that fits the situation. They learn to laugh at each other. They learn to argue with each other. And through that process, they changed. So, and they took, each one took a little bit from the other. This shows us, above all, what the reason it was interesting for me, how literary conventions are used and how they clash and are reconciled with each other. But it can also, it's a model, you know, for thinking about interactions between individuals who have certain stories. They inhabit certain stories. Why? Who tells them, to whom, how, from what materials are they put together? Are those stories challenged by others? Do they adjust the stories when they are challenged? And how do they continue developing morally and socially through that interaction? So to conclude, my research, my study was definitely about novels and genre, and about the aesthetic expectations that are in those cases. But it's also about the social relations that produce and challenge those aesthetic expectations. And this helps us parse out what is truth, what is fiction, and how are these constructed and interpreted, why, in what context, and how do they continue to develop? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Halevi Weiss, for sharing with us about your study, about the model you developed in your book. And just to briefly answer your question, when I was looking for speakers for this cafe, and I found your work as like studying the novel as a genre, and also study the interactions that happen within the novel and what characters teach each other while discussing fictional stories, I thought it was a very interesting complementary perspective to the social aspect of fiction. In one sense, we have how we can train our social cognition, like us putting ourselves in the place of characters, taking the perspective of characters, but this other aspect that you touch in the more aesthetic sense of how characters within the novel interact and take something from each other, and also how it reflects some of the social dilemmas of the different times in history where the novels developed, thought was very interesting to put together with the other perspectives we're sharing here today. So thank you. And before we pass the questions, I'm going to introduce our third and last panelist, who's Dr. Erin Soros. Dr. Erin Soros is a postdoctoral fellow in the Society for the Humanities at Cornell University, where she is researching psychoanalytic conceptions of psychic energy and psychosis as a response to trauma. She has published fiction and nonfiction in international anthologies and journals, including short fiction, the Iowa Review, the Indiana Review, Exile Literary Quarterly, Gaze, Prism, West Coast Line, Fiddlehead, and En route. And her studies have been produced for the CBC and BBC as winners of the CBC Literary Award and the Commonwealth Award for the short story. She has published academic articles as well, weaving psychoanalysis, philosophy, and autobiographical narrative. New work has appeared in Literatures of Madness, published by Palgrave Macmillan, and in Women of the Psychosocial Construction of Madness, Lexington Press. She has received a Fulbright Award, the Governor General's Gold Medal, and 2 teaching awards, including Columbia University Presidential Award for Excellence in Teaching. So without further introduction, let's welcome our speaker, Dr. Erin Soros.
Unmute me, there we go. Hi, thank you so much, Fernanda, and thank you for finding me. And I know how you found me, so thank you, Ian, as well, in the crowd. And I'm very excited to be here. I'm an interdisciplinary scholar. I call myself an interdisciplinary weirdo. And so I'm always happy to find other like-minded weirdos, and to think the energies and tensions and possibilities, the incommensurabilities between fields. So I'm really excited to hear questions and suggestions for reading or comments. So thank you so much. I'm going to start with a reading from my own work. This has been published, and I'll put the link up in a second, but I'm not sharing the screen. I'm going to be reading it as one does at a literary reading. So it's a lyric essay, and I will talk about it. I'll be reading a short excerpt, and then I'll be giving you a larger context for the work and showing how fiction has helped me understand some of the things I'm addressing in the essay. Who could have lived? No one wakes up thinking of a stranger, a life away, falling. Dion Brand, Thirsty. It isn't my neighborhood. It isn't my car either, but I seem to be driving it, my slick hands slipping on the steering wheel of this borrowed vehicle that carries me in such a protected fashion through my city. The car's gleaming metal skin between myself and the people who like to lurch their legs right in front of traffic on Main Street, as if to say a human body could be value enough to stop 2 tons of gasoline-powered steel. They flaunt sloppy smiles and missing teeth and bruises on cheeks and tracks on arms, like the ones that once marked my brother. I follow signage, storefronts, street signs, even the words on people's t-shirts directing me to the next light. Each sign holds a secret code, and if you read them all together, they form one long, beautiful sentence that will tell me where I can find my beloved. Let's call him B, that bulbous letter we can learn to shape so soon after the first one that is all straight lines like these streets. I keep driving, past Granville Street and turning on Burrard Street, along Burrard Bridge. 2-letter B's under the lucid blue sky. And I know it isn't safe for me to be driving, not when every piece of the alphabet is ricocheting within the car, even now when I'm no longer rattling down Seymour Street, but seeing more and more sky above the car as if the car could lift right into the horizon. I park the car a few blocks west of South Granville, where the lawns are green and the house is tidy and people obey crosswalks, no one chicken dancing against all the rolling wheels. I throw away the keys, or at least they are gone. Those keys to that car that is not mine. And I know this neighborhood really isn't mine any more than the last one, but I am walking through it now and asking strangers, so many strangers, if they can help me to find liberty. The store where my sister works, where I'm sure my family is holding the surprise wedding. Sunlight glints off glass storefronts. On South Granville, the women are wearing heels and the men talking to smartphones. No one I pass has signs on their t-shirts. I modulate my voice to sound reasonable. Excuse me, can you tell me where to find liberty? They say left, and I think about being left wing. I think about being left, how my beloved has left me. Now I'm sure B can be found if I could just turn left, but I have turned left too many times. And again, I ask a stranger and she says, right. And I think of human rights and my right to be free of that other human. Let's call him D, the man who harassed me at an American college so far from this shiny, bright neighborhood that is not mine. I can see his face now in the faces of strangers. Even though I have flown away from that American college where D once left a gift inside my locker, inside the women's changing room, private space, inside a private space. But here, I am in public. Here, these are the people of the neighborhood, the shopkeeper and the hairdresser and the waitress in the restaurant where I asked to use the washroom, and I am once more in a private space. And as I wash my hands, I can hear the lyrics on the sound system giving me clues about how to escape D and find B. And I am looking for freedom. I am looking for liberty. Can you tell me where to find liberty? On Thursday, August 9th, 2007, I am involuntarily admitted to a psychiatric facility, restrained to a bed, my arms and legs bound, my body locked within solitary confinement behind a double door. On Monday, August 13th, 2007, the day I am released from solitary, still unfree, but at least allowed to wander the ward and to speak to the other patients. Vancouver police confront Paul Glenn Boyd on South Granville. He walks incoherent on the same street that I had wandered just days before. He recognizes friends in the features of strangers. He swings a bike chain and then releases the bike chain and uses his hands instead to crawl on the ground as 8 bullets puncture his flesh. That long street, that innocent weekend, together form a hinge, joining one mad woman to one mad man, both gap and connection between life and death. I'll put a link to the entire text in the chat. Give it to everyone. Here we go. So the text goes on and it weaves Dion Brand's poetry together with a meditation on people who were killed by police, primarily Black people. Paul Glenn Boyd was white, but police who are responding to a mental health crisis. And what I meditate on is imagining the possibility of speech in those moments or listening in those moments and what kind of listening could be possible. And and in this essay, I'm thinking specifically of what it means to be a neighbor on the street. So it's a theorizing around what the ethics of the neighbor is. So it's not specifically about the police violence. It's about the moments before, the moments that neighbor the bullets. And I'm working in a larger collection. And this is an autobiographical piece. It describes my first experience of psychosis and being held in solitary confinement. It was my first of 5 involuntary hospitalizations. And what I found in the hospital was I arrived in the hospital actually well trained to understand psychosis. Like my background is in psychoanalysis. I'm a literary scholar. I'm very interested in language and ruptures of language. And I had in no admission did anyone ever ask me about my story or situate my experience within a story. And I was stunned at this. I shouldn't have been so stunned, but I just was odd that I kept wanting to tell a story and to situate what had happened, which was a form of psychosis, but it was a response to things. It was a response to events. And what I wanted to share is that I had started reading in the 90s. I was reading Black women writers in the 90s, African-American, Canadian, Caribbean, Zimbabwean, South African. I can list names, I'll put them in the Erna Brodwer, Toni Morrison, Gail Jones, Norbesi Phillips, Dion Brand, Essie Head, Tsitsi Dangaramba. And what they taught me in their language is 3 things. One, that language breaks down under conditions of extreme individual and collective trauma, that language starts to fragment, that something starts to happen at the level of a signifier. So that was one thing. They also showed me that breakdown itself can be not just pathology, but itself a kind of testimony, a way of showing something, of revealing atrocity. And then the third thing, and these are different, like it's hard to hold these all together, but this third thing that I saw in their work was that breakdown in language itself is almost like a kind of a crack that opens something, that you start to see some other possibility, some other way of speaking, something else can be revealed. And if I have time, I was going to show, do I have time? I don't know, when I wasn't paying attention to when I started.
I'm not sure. I didn't pay attention when you started either, but you can do, like, if you're going to show the Toni Morrison excerpts, I think we have a couple.
Okay, I will show the Toni Morrison excerpt because this piece in particular, it was her first book, and I'm going to do that thing where we share screens, and I'm sure the computer will blow up. Here it is. Okay, so back to you, and I just hit share screen. Sort of. Okay. Here it is. I make this bigger. There we go. Can you see the text? Yes.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. This is the end of The Bluest Eye. And in this text, the girl is speaking to another. There's a kind of splitting of consciousness. And a young girl, Piccola, is speaking to someone who sees her, another voice, a split of self. My students and I sort of opened this up. There are various possibilities. The novel itself moves into a kind of poetry here. But there's two voices, one asking questions and listening and attending and then taunting. And Piccola, this Black girl, believes she now has blue eyes. And she's using this voice as a mirror in way to kind of keep talking to her about her blue eyes. And I don't think it would take much for people to understand if a Black girl entered a psych ward now who was hearing someone that isn't there and speaking to someone who isn't there and potentially seeing things that aren't there with a delusional belief about blue eyes. There would be specific and fairly quick diagnoses. In my experience, the hospital diagnoses happen really fast. And what's interesting about Toni Morrison's work is she backtracks this. I mean, this is the end of the novel, but we see the moments, the pressures, the racial pressures on this girl's mind and body. From the very opening of the book, we start with this. So it's this kind of benign, like the whiteness is benign. As here's the house, it is green and white, it has a red door, it is very pretty. Here is the family, mother, father, Dick and Jane live in the green and white house. They are very happy. See Jane. I mean, I read this garbage in grade 1 and hated. I thought that like this is no music, but this text becomes increasingly monstrous in the ways that Morrison does this with a citation practice. So she starts with this, and then she repeats the same material, but without the punctuation. So it's speeding up. And again, there's a kind of manic energy here. Something's going a bit awry. You could feel the strangeness. And then the next section, she repeats it again without spaces between the words. And this, I would argue that this is on the verge of a kind of psychotic language. That if you took an excerpt of this and put it in a notebook and had it in handwriting, could be collected. My writings were collected as evidence of psychotic language. This could be little bits of this. It doesn't hold. It doesn't make sense. But you could see that she's doing something with it. She's actually saying there's something here that is really awry. Something is going wrong in this repetition. The repetition doesn't stay itself. But it's also that you almost see that there's a kind of madness in this text. There's something off about Steve, Jick, and Dane. Jane. There's something not right about it. And the speed of the language helps us to start seeing this. And then she also has throughout the text, so she starts here with the frame of literature and the whiteness of literature itself, a kind of violence. And then throughout the novel, and I don't have the time to go through all the different moments, but she shows Piccola's experience of the racism, the visceral racism she receives from store clerks who don't really want to look at her, from her own mother and her internalized racism, from her girlfriends, from the boarders in her house, who there's a lot of discussion of like Ginger Rogers and who's that one with the tap dancing? Shirley Temple, like that, the idea of the ideal white mirror that this girl is growing up with. So there's the racial structures, the historical structures putting this pressure on her. And there's also experiences of sexual violation in the story, extreme violation. And what she has at one passage, Morrison says, and it had occurred to Piccola some time ago that if her eyes, those eyes that held the pictures and knew the sights, if those eyes of hers were different, that is to say beautiful, she herself would be different. Her teeth were good, and at least her nose was not big and flat like some of those who were thought so cute. if she looked different, beautiful, maybe Charlie would be different, and Mrs. Breedlove too. Maybe they'd say, well, look at pretty-eyed Pecola. We mustn't do bad things in front of those pretty eyes. And so you could see that she has a kind of way of controlling, that the pretty eyes as a wish is a way of controlling and believing that she has some control over this trauma. And they become, I mean, it's a kind of monstrous vision, or it is a monstrous vision at the end, but it's also a way of naming and testifying to what she has been experiencing and making it terribly visible. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Soros. And well, before we open the questions to the public, we already have quite a few questions. I just want to thank you for this, sharing this essay and sharing this third perspective in which we see how we're somehow all transported and all projected to your own story, kind of like exemplifying this simulation of experience that Dr. Oatley had shared with us. So I think we had three perspectives and three examples of how literary fiction can improve our social cognition, simulate social worlds, show us social dilemmas, and in this case, how it can open the door to worlds we rarely have access to, worlds of people that may be diagnosed in psychiatry without knowing their story behind, or the stories of people that have been discriminated against. So this is something I'm very interested in, and how literary fiction can improve empathy in these cases, or these examples that we rarely have access to, these testimonies, to these voices, to these stories that are being told. So thank you very much for that. I don't know if the rest of the panelists want to say something before I read the questions from the public. Professor Oatley or Dr. Halevi-Weiss, would you like to add something before I read the questions?
Yeah, I think if you just go to the questions, that would be fine. I think what you were both saying was very interesting, but thank you.
Okay, so we have a first question by Arta Jami, and he's asking, at what point does the literal turn into the ideology? What is it about texts that allows them to enter and alter the views and beliefs held by the reader? So any of you that wants to answer, feel free to.
Well, I can say something. I think the thing about art is that it doesn't set out to persuade. It's not like advertising. It's not like a political speech. It doesn't try and get someone to think this is what you should believe, or anything like that. It actually has a quality not of making anybody do something. What it does is it enables people, if they want to take part in this. And so I think it's the reader who's actually going to, if she or he wants, reflect on what they've read. And so, but it isn't a kind of persuasion. Okay, that's what I have to say.
Yes, would any of the other panelists want to add anything on why?
Well, I guess that if I base myself on the case studies that I did in the book Interactive Fiction, altering the literal, which would be the story, the way it would be told if there wasn't arguing, if somebody was not talking back and asking for something different. So alterations in that literal storytelling, what allows for change, what demands change, seems to be usually a need experienced by the listeners. And the argument also has to do with the need related to the intention and the purpose of the storyteller. So usually the need takes the form of a fear, a very specific fear of something that is happening at the moment, or a desire. They want something, and the teller and the listener want something completely different. You know, they have different lives, and they're each experiencing the story in different ways because of it, and demanding changes in the literal because of it.
Thank you. We have another question. I think this is for Dr. Oatley from Marianne Chaoud. She's asking, can this research be used as therapy for kids who have trouble recognizing emotions or reading other people's mental states?
Yes, I think a lot of people have started to think in that kind of way. And I don't know any, very convincing results yet, but I get a lot of people asking me that question. And so what it seems like is yes. So we have done a little bit of therapy. So people who are emotionally avoidant, if they read one of Chekhov's short stories, they can start to experience emotions that they're too frightened to experience in everyday life. So that's a kind of therapy. And I think also, it looks like, for instance, stories are better for little children than just watching whatever happens to be on television. So just watching television doesn't do much for anyone. And the kids can't really, distinguish between, the program and the advertisements. But stories have a kind of invitation that you can enter them. And that's probably rather important because it sort of mirrors a kind of entering into a friendship.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. There was a question that was actually related to that and said that the paper you presented that mentions that reading stories to children improved their theory of mind while watching television didn't. And Luis is asking, is this because television doesn't give us access to the private thought of characters? Mm-hmm. So do you think a movie where we have access to characters' thought would have the same effect as reading?
Yes, it does. No, there's a lot of research on that. So films, television series, even some video games. Yeah. So these things where you enter in and you enter into a set of circumstances that you wouldn't ordinarily have done in your own life. So as Erin was saying, if you want to experience what it's like to be involuntarily hospitalized, then you can read this. And so part of, an increase in empathy is if you read a lot, then you get a much, much, much wider perspective than just sort of talking to the people who you happen to know.
Exactly. Thank you. I think it also broadens the range of people we can meet. One can only, be presented with a certain number of characters in real life, and through books, we interact with many other characters that we would never actually be face to face with.
Exactly.
We have another question from Arta. Why do religious texts hold such influence throughout history? What is it about their effects on human psychology that allows them to motivate our every move, personal, political, etc.?
I think maybe the question seems to imply that the influence is negative. And in fact, more people have been killed in the name of God than perhaps in the name of anyone else. I mean, that my grandfather used to say that I don't know if he actually counted, but certainly lots of people have been tortured and killed in the name of this or that God. But that is a negative point of view. But I think that on the most part, religious texts have been very positive and valuable in creating precisely the kind of empathy and ability to think more broadly than that you guys have been mentioning. So maybe it would be helpful to think in terms of Abraham Maslow's pyramid, and that the religious texts, especially the very ancient ones, helped people fulfill the need to get away from just basic needs of the body and shelter. And now they could think more also about abstract ideas and about creativity, because those texts are also art and so forth.
Thank you. I have a question that I think maybe the three of you could respond like one after the other. It's Carlos Frederizo. He's saying hi from Mexico City, and he's asking if you think that does the empathetic response or empathic response depend on the quality of the fiction? So whoever wants to start, feel free.
I think quality is such a big, there's so many questions around what constitutes quality, but one thing I was thinking about both religious texts and of the literature that I'm attending to is that we don't tend to think, we think of literature as on the page, but I think of it as also physical. So the rhythm and the antiphony in a religious service, the way that it enters your body in a way that there's a tactile sense. So to me, I wonder, I'm not a scientist, but I wonder about the ways that language becomes in certain kinds of literary or poetic texts itself a texture, that it has a different effect. But I'm also hesitant. I do think that there's, I wouldn't teach literature if I didn't think that it expanded us. But I also know that I taught a class on human rights, and there was an idea of like the ascendancy of the novel and human rights, but there was also quite negative forces at play when the novel was like the ways that literature can function within a machine and colonialism is going full force and the backdrop of the literature. So there's a way in which the stories create empathy and a sense of identification for some characters and not for others. And so we've been well trained to have that experience. And you can sometimes misidentify, like you connect and then you realize that's not your story and you're kind of thrown out. So I think those conversations are complex, because I think fiction can actually play a role in genocide. It can play a role in colonialism. And I think, I went through a university system and got an honors degree I read one writer of color in a full 5-year honors program. So and it's not, those texts, I think Jane Austen increases empathy, but there's also things that aren't being said on the page.
Yeah.
Okay, if you want to add anything else, go ahead. Otherwise, I can go for the next question. I like this one. What does getting lost in the story or getting lost in the book actually mean from a psychological perspective?
Okay, let me answer that. There's a rather interesting person called Melanie Green who works on this idea of transportation. So what you do is you transport yourself into the story, and you give up part of yourself, and you sort of become, what you do is we've all got ways of thinking what we're going to do, this evening and tomorrow and so on. And so we make plans, and what we do is we put that planning process away and put it on one side, and we take on the plans and intentions of a character. And so we give up a piece of ourselves and in a kind of way become that other person. And it's something of that kind that enables us to change within ourselves. And that, I think, another possibility, but we only do that if we really want to. So nobody's making us do that. something like that.
Thank you. I really like that response. Now I got lost in the chat. I forgot to say, whoever wants to open their, like turn on their cameras or open their mics and ask questions like through voice, be very like, Christian, would you like to go ahead, please?
I was just putting the question over there. So seems to me very interesting how we are kind of obsessed with recording, right? Like writing books, writing papers. And if you don't write a paper, a book or something, you are not successful. However, the basis for the way that we tell a story is orality. And since that we have leave orality behind, even talk about orality as something primitive. So what do you think that the difference in contribution to society reside in orality and in written text? And should we start to focus again in orality to maybe, since we are talking about empathy, to create empathy again? What are the difference between both of them?
Mm-hmm.
That's a beautiful question. I'm very interested in oral storytelling because I come from a family where there was fairly low or no literacy, and I didn't grow up with books, but I grew up with teaching and listening. That it would be nothing for me to walk back and forth in the kitchen while my mom would be on the phone like for hours. Like she would say nothing. She would just be nodding, like because someone was going through something, and like that was just a kind of teaching. And my field is psychoanalysis, so that translation to this practice of what it means to sit, and psychoanalytic practice is that you actually are working so hard to be attentive to the particular texture of somebody else's story and their psyche. And so that's one element. And then I think in terms of indigenous storytelling, that yes, I mean, that's what I said about the dangers of thinking about books and the ways that literature played a role in colonialism, that the traditions that were interrupted by law, by violence, by separating kin, that those are also, I would imagine, and I don't study those. I mean, I studied the traditions as a listener and a literary scholar, but not as a scientist. But yeah, I would imagine that is a kind of expansion in yourself as you're attentive to another person's story. I'm giving a talk in 2 weeks on Tracy Lindbergh's Birdie. She's a Cree writer. And I'm actually looking at how the novel teaches law and the idea of Cree law being about listening and what it means to listen to another person.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. We have other questions. I had seen one. Let me just, okay, so Margot Lapierre is asking, Dr. Oatley, you mentioned that it isn't about fiction versus nonfiction, but art versus non-art. I guess that reading memoirs would not differ too much in its cognitive effect on the reader when compared to fiction. So which of these sounds more accurate in where the division lies? True to life versus not true to life, or narrativized versus non-narrativized?
Yes, I mean, you know, when we started doing these experiments, it was easy to distinguish books that were fiction as compared with explanatory non-fiction. You know, so that was the first distinction that we made. But as all this research has gone on, it's clear that that isn't really the distinction. So the distinction really is about what we might call life stories, what we human beings are up to with each other. And so it's fiction, memoir, autobiography, ordinary biography, some kinds of history, as compared with, for instance, you know, how to, well, you know, stars and planets, or, you know, how to unblock your drain if it's got, you know, stuff in it, and, you know, things about the physical world. And so that's really, I think, the distinction. And so what fiction is about really is we human beings, you know, we have intentions, but often they don't go very well. And it's sort of a bit like, you know, if you're learning to fly an airplane, you see, if you're just up there in the sky, nothing much happens. But if you go in a flight simulator, then you can experience lots of different kinds of things, which you wouldn't generally do in ordinary life. But if something comes along that is like that, you will have had a little bit of experience of how to deal with it within yourself. And so I think it was Aristotle who said that fiction is a more serious business than history because it's about what can happen. And so I think that's getting a bit closer to the center of.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think I've read most of the questions. I don't know if anybody has another question. You can write it, you can open your mic. Otherwise, we can pass to some closing remarks before we say goodbye and give some closure to this wonderful panel.
I was going to say, I was really interested, Keith, I agree. I'm really moved by this, your attention to the ways that we can shift our own consciousness by reading. But I'm also interested in how writing teaches us sometimes the limits and teaches like that there's at some level we're returned to the text, and I would have to do a closer reading and show examples, but I find it interesting that fiction is both inviting us to that place and then giving us a sense of its limits. I'm working on a piece, a long essay that is specifically about solitary confinement, and what I'm arguing in the piece is that experience cannot be communicated, because if I communicate it, I'm not in solitary. It's a paradox, like that I can never communicate that because I'm speaking about it. So it's not the experience. Does that make sense? So, and that's one example, but I think a lot of interesting literature actually stages this crisis.
Yeah. No, I get what you're saying. But you see, I think if you're a writer and you're just talking about exactly doing that, you see, in your writing, you're saying, now, this is what it was like for me. And empathetically, we could say, oh, yeah, I can imagine myself into that situation. And without what you've been doing, we may not even have thought of that. Yeah. But your invitation invites us. So, I mean, it seems to me, you know, that's also what we do with each other when we're talking and, you know, gossiping and saying, oh, you know, this is what happened and, you know, it was awful, or, you know, this is what that person did. But it widens that. I think what literature does is it widens that much more broadly than, you know, just from the people we know. And you see, it's also what you're saying is a writer, you know, so you're talking about Don Quixote. So I don't know how long it took that person, you know, to write that. It could be years. And so they've worked very, very hard on it. And, you know, this wasn't quite right, so we change it and so on. And you put yourself as a writer into the role of the reader, and you go backwards and forwards. And so it's a piece of consciousness that you can pass over to someone else. It seems to me, something like that.
Okay, I'm gonna go for one last.
Christiane was trying to ask a question, I think.
Go ahead, Christian. Interrupt, please.
So I was just remember, you know, like 10 years ago, I used to play a lot of role games, like the old type of games where you will get with your friends and tell a story. And we will spend hours telling the stories about words and characters and people that didn't exist. These were not books. These were stories that we were creating in the moment. And they were so powerful in the sense that we will get on these stories for weeks, and we will have almost like parallel lives of our characters. In those storylines, our characters will do things, we will talk about them like they were actually real people. So it made me just thinking exactly that when Jael was talking about Don Quixote, for example, and Keith now just asked how long it took to Cervantes to write Don Quixote. I just think in the size of the book, and I think, oh my God, it probably was a long time to write that masterpiece.
Actually, 2 books that were written 10 years apart.
Yes.
The second one responds to the criticism
Yes.
and the feedback of the first one, and this first one appears in the second one. Don Quixote is reading the first one, and he's also reading this other continuation that a real person, Avellaneda, composed, and Cervantes was furious, and that one is so stupid, such a stupid version that's why Cervantes took up his pen again and wrote second part, which is better than part 1, and then Don Quixote dies at the end. Sorry, Christiana.
No, that's thinking. I mean, it's part of this, right? Like I imagine this kind of conversations precisely because that's why they are. I love literature, but as I was telling Erin before, literature is so close in a box, right? It's kind of alive when you read it, but a conversation is more alive because you really don't know what's going to happen after. So that's why for me, orality, or the same thing what I mentioned, storytelling in role play, is so fascinating because you don't really know how the story is going to finish. You have an idea, but it depends on all the people that is participating in the story. So I just think that it is fascinating. So yeah, that's all what I want to say.
Yeah.
Totally, thank you. Okay, so there's one more question from Arta, who opened his camera. We can see him now. He's asking, why do children have such a pull towards storytelling, the typical bedtime story? And why do we find such archetypal figures in children's stories, like the cricket in Pinocchio, Jimmy Cricket, which is a philosopher of sorts and serves as Pinocchio's conscience, and saying he would be like a euphemism for Jesus Christ or some kind of like religious figure.
I feel like you have an answer for this question. That's what
I do. You say I do have an answer for this question?
The questioner.
Oh, Arta, yeah. Do you want to share with us?
No, I was actually quite confused because usually you'd assume that in children's stories, there is just a simple narrative to follow. But in this case, like, I didn't know that the cricket, Jiminy Cricket, was also a euphemism for Jesus Christ in, I think, Southern America. I don't know where, but I read that somewhere. I was just confused. Why are there such big figures of sorts that take philosophers and psychologists years to decipher in children's stories? What is it about that? You know?
Yeah, it's from what I know this, like there's a line, The Witch and the Wardrobes, which is also a Christian allegory. But I also know, I've heard from indigenous storytellers that there are, and I would cite people if I were prepared to, this was the theme of my talk, but I just, things that I've learned are that there can be a story and then you will tell a different story. I'm thinking of Leanne Simpson's teachings that I've learned from my elders as well, that there are different stories, the same story, and you will tell it over and over and over and over again. And so it has, like, there's a simpler version, but it has a lot of complexity and archetypal meaning. And then you'll hear it again and again, and the story kind of grows in depth as you get older. So I think that kind of nuance and largeness working in a story that seems for a young age, and from what I've learned from indigenous traditions, that's a similar model. And I think it's a kind of, in terms of expansion, it expands you into a tradition.
Yeah.
Thank you, Erin. I see that Alberto raised his hand. Alberto, you want to unmute yourself?
I wanted to add, well, thank you for all the presentations. It's amazing to mix all these subjects like Fernanda does in her posts usually about what I'm sorry, I don't know if Arta or Giami is your name. What he said about the archetypes, I'm curious that if you share that maybe this is like, well, a reflection of the folklore and how the folklore use the tales through history also as a moral way to transfer knowledge, because it's very typical. We always talk about which is the most ancient tale that we can trace back and all that, but we also know that many of those trace morals that are shared out of religion, out of all things that are very culturally entangled, because they share popular knowledge. And one of the ways, as I think Erin said, is that the orality makes some of the messages of not only the stories, but the message through the stories make them more alive. If you hear something that you have to learn as an example of someone who has lived it, or in many of the tales has suffered the consequences of not following the moral, it's more probable. I mean, it's an education thing, right? An education effect. It's more probable that they're going to remember the story. So I like that. Sometimes I've read by some experts in folklore that it's probably, we will never know if the story came first or the education motivation came first. I like to think that they were born at the same time, but this is just to point out as the archetypes that they say that I think has to do something with the orality evolution parallel, as Erin said, that stories have since the origin of, well, humanity.
Thank you. So finally, I don't know if there's any questions that I missed. If there's any questions that I missed, you can like raise your hand, open your mic, write it in the chat, and take the opportunity to ask our panelists. I wanted to, okay, so what is it about the nature of storytelling that seems to comprise such a large portion of human cognition? Why are we compelled to listen to someone who is well articulated? What is it about a good narrative that causes us to divert all our attention singularly on the voice that delivers said story? And I think we mentioned a little bit about this. So I would like maybe as a last question open to the three panelists to hear your take on like how much of all of these effects that narrative and fiction has on us is thanks to verbal language. Like what is it that verbal language gives or adds to other forms of sharing experience? And I think it connects to the question of why are we compelled to listen to someone who is well articulated.
Okay, I think I can start on that. I mean, language, human language, probably, you know, humans evolved the ability to speak with each other probably about 200,000 years ago. And before that, if you look at what the chimpanzees do, if they want to foster a relationship, they sit down with each other and they do cuddling, and then they pick the sort of bits of dirt off each other's skin and so on, right? But if you've got a lot of friends, it takes a lot of time to do that. And if you're a human being, you might want to do that with several people at once, like we're doing now, you see? And so language grew out of this interaction with other people and forming friendships and you know, being with that other person. And so, and that's been very, very central to being a human being. And then I think what we've just been talking about now with culture and religion is a lot of these stories, because a whole bunch of people know them, they allow people to group themselves with each other within a particular society. And that's very important as well. So you actually have a shared understanding of something. So those are my little thoughts.
I think that storytelling is an extremely complex form of communication. So Christian was talking about these themes, art themes around color. And in visual art, we have shapes and we have color, and maybe it can suggest a kind of story. In music, the sounds may elicit certain feelings, right? Sad or happy. But storytelling is all of those things and more, right? Because storytelling has, you were talking about the orality, it has the cadence of repetition and alliteration and all of that. So it's like music. And perhaps the more it's like music, the more seductive it is. The issue of repetition and variation, also from the point of view of events, of the action, is also part of what seduces us into some worlds, fictional worlds, and keeps us there longer than in others, and keeps us very sorry when it ends, because there's repetition, variation, and we want more. And then when we read, we imagine these, like art. We imagine shapes, we imagine colors, we imagine all of that, and much more on top of that, the psychology, the deeper relationships. So it's just like it wins the lottery of everything possible.
This is moving me because, I mean, it kind of takes me back full circle to where I said that in the psych ward, nobody asked me of my story. And I think storytelling, and it can be therapeutic or psychoanalytic where you have a professional, but I found often it would be literally the guy pushing this broom in my room, or who the taxi driver in the essay that I just read from. There's a taxi driver who is attuned and kind of grasped, and I can't make sense in the taxi. He manages to make sense, and we find where I'm supposed to go. And the people who would serve me porridge in the psych ward would often be more attentive to my story and to that interchange that we were just hearing about, like the dialogue of the conversation. And so I find it very strange that you get people in a crisis and you actually remove them from that healing interchange of just sharing one story and hearing another story. And we all know what it feels like to feel heard, to have just a simple telling your own story and having somebody hear you, that itself. And the neuroscientist, Eric, I'm just looking at his name, Kandel, he says, what's interesting, and this is about our disciplines meeting, is that speech is a neurological event, that it actually changes how our minds are working. And so I think it's interesting that we don't have to leave a medical model. We don't have to completely abandon the idea that there is a medical body or a physical body, to think about how could speech heal even severe, help heal even, and storytelling heal even severe mental illness.
Thank you. And yes, that brings me to the core of what has been like this project and what I have been doing first with Synapsis and then through this Science Cafes in the Convergence Initiative, which is opening these dialogues among disciplines to show that this is not about like neuroscientists explaining artists what they do. Like artists know what they know. There's nothing we're going to explain to them. This is a way to reach a point in which, we can see that science and in humanities and philosophies are not as divided anymore. We can find meeting points, and these meeting points are helpful to teach people how art can be therapeutic, to teach people how art can lead to well-being, can lead to enriching lives. So I think that's a little bit of the purpose of what we have been doing here. And I'm very thankful with all of you for having participated in this panel. And before, with a closing note, I thought of one last question. And so I'd like to ask our panelists if you were to recommend one novel or one book. I know there are many, but if each one of you could choose one to recommend to our audience, that thing that to prove the point of this social cognition, empathy, and living other people's lives can enrich ours.
Okay, I think it's very hard to do better than Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice.
Thank you.
I would recommend Tsitsi's Dengaramba's Nervous Conditions. It's her first novel. And it addresses similar dynamics that I was talking about with Morrison, where you'd have someone who's genuinely suffering from what we would describe as a psychiatric problem, but it's placed within the larger structures of colonialism. And it's a vividly told story that you will feel connected to the characters.
Yeah, it's your turn.
Well, I just taught Pride and Prejudice, and I will teach it next year also. But I think I will recommend to you The Lover by A.B. Yehoshua. A.B. Yehoshua is an Israeli writer.
Yeah.
I just finished writing a book about him. And The Lover is his first full-fledged novel. And told from, like Faulkner, told from the point of view of 6 characters, all of who experience the same situation from a different point of view. And there are actually many, many lovers in that text.
Okay, well, thank you everybody so much. I finally just let an open mic if you want to say anything else to close. No?
Oh, I was going to say, this is Margot's comment about, she prompted me to remember that I think of the psychotic language, if you think about word salad and Klein associations, that it is actually working with the poetry of language that we were speaking about earlier, the pleasure in language. And so that is, and my lab was the psych ward, and I had patients telling me poems, reciting poems to me, writing out things on, I had Derek Walcott's Omeris, they were writing out things frantically on Omeris. They wanted to hear the music of their own language heard.
Very interesting. I hadn't seen the question saying that psychosis is seeing patterns that others aren't noticing or seeing. And there's something craft-like, literary, musical. And we have also talked about, like, creativity and psychosis, the parallels in which these associations that are hard to make for some people or that we would normally see come as natural, more naturally, during a psychotic state or for psychotic patients. So, well, if unless anything has anything else to say, I would like to thank you, thank all the panelists for sharing their points of view today. I would like to thank the Fonds de Recherche du Québec that financed this project, the Centre de Recherche en Éthique, Convergence Initiative, also Ian Gold, who's my supervisor and has been helping throughout all this organization of these cafes, and my mom, who's also there.
Okay.
So thank you everyone. Margaret saying thank you, Keith, Erin, and Fernanda. And
well, thank you very much. It's very, very interesting and very good interaction here. Thank you, and thank you everybody for coming and for all your questions, and for the organizers. Thank you.
Yeah. Very much appreciated.
Sorry.
Well, I want us to have wine and cheese somewhere nice in Montreal. I am wearing a hat for you people.
We miss the wine and cheese.
Oh, it's such a lonely feeling at the end where you're like, now we get to go have fun and mill and hear how things go, and somebody can share their story. And
you just get to close the screen now, and everything is dark. It's like, oh.
Yeah. It's kind of when a movie ends.
Well,
go back to
okay, we should have some wine and cheese and have each other in mind.
Hopefully, I'm looking forward to.
We can make up stories.
Exactly. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye. Have a great evening.
Fernanda, ¿tu mamá estaba ahí?
Sí.
¡Qué churi!
Ahí está todavía.
Delia Juárez, ¿cierto?
Sí, ahí está.
Hola, un gusto.
Está cerrado tu micrófono, Ma. Está todavía la transmisión.